the idea of democracy. As a legacy we have received from Greece, as a legacy we have received from Rome. It's a false paradigm that has rolled through history to our own days. And I explained to them that it wasn't a matter of semantics. It's simply more than that, it's a matter of history. Due to the importance that holds, I am going to emphasize that principle. The false paradigm arises when we think that because our term democracy is the same term the Greeks used 2,400 or 2,500 years ago, it means the same thing. And it's not like that. It is true, yes, it is true that democracy maintains an etymological connection with the concept of government by the people. But in ancient Greece, democracy represented a very different political and social reality. Not just very different, entirely different from what we today call democracy in the 21st century in our modernity. In ancient Athens, democracy was linked to an elite, a small group of people. Only the free men of Athens only. No one else. Only the free men of Athens. Those who were considered the citizens of Athens had the right to participate in those assemblies. And that excluded, of course, all women and foreigners, to the famous Matekos. And it also excluded the slaves. They were excluded. That is, when the Greeks, 2,500 years ago, when they talked about democracy, it was not an inclusive system like the one we have today. It was not a system where the rights of all inhabitants are respected. Absolutely not at all. And today, in contrast, modern democracy is understood as a system based on inclusion. In the equality of rights for all citizens, independently of their gender, whether they are men or women, regardless of race, regardless of social status. And this does not usually happen in ancient Greece. That's not what happened in ancient Greece. Furthermore, we are not only talking about the concept of democracy. There are other concepts that etymologically they are the same, because our Spanish language owes much to Greek, owes much to Latin. But what I'm saying is that it's not just democracy. There are other terms too. They are related, etymologically, but not ontologically. For example, republic. That's another idea, right? The term res publica, that is public matters, public affairs. What does republic mean? Etymologically speaking, res publica, public matters, public affairs in ancient Rome. It meant a system of government in which power was limited to the magistrates. Power was limited to the Senate, where social classes played an extremely important role. So even when there was some citizen participation, it was limited to Roman citizens. That present, it was limited to the citizens of Panko. In any case, the citizen participation was limited. The rest did not have access to that. So the Republic, the Roman one, had a hierarchical structure, and that hierarchical structure was exclusionary. It was exclusive of the majority of full citizens. Today, when we talk, for example, about the Republic of Ecuador or the Republic of Colombia, does not mean at all what the Republic meant for the Romans. Nowadays, when we talk in the 21st century, when we talk about a republic, we are talking about a system of government where the power of a nation, it lies with representatives who have been democratically elected. That is, without excluding any citizen, be it a man, a woman, rich, poor, literate, or illiterate. So for us in modern times, the notion of republic has connotations of social equality. It has connotations of justice, important concepts of justice, values that in ancient Rome were not fundamental. For them, it was not fundamental at all. That is an example, but you can give another example. For example, let's talk about freedom. Yes, freedom. What concept did the ancients have of freedom? What concept did the ancients have of freedom? Well, freedom for the Romans was limited only to free people. That's where the concept of freedom was limited. That is, to people who weren't in a condition of slavery. However, women and other groups were subject to a lot of restrictions, lacking rights, politicians, and freedom in that sense was linked to the condition of not being a slave, But it did not imply necessarily equality or civil rights, human rights, as we conceive it today in our modernity. So, in contrast with all this reality in our representative democracies, modern societies, the concept of freedom is related to a much broader range of individual rights, protection against discrimination, etc. Topics that were not known, were not handled in ancient Rome. And the examples that I have mentioned to you, democracy, republic, freedom, for example, are examples that show language as a reflection of culture. We cannot deny that. Language is a reflection of culture. Language reflects what the values of a certain time period are. And therefore, the meaning of words evolves as much as people do, as much as societies do. Therefore, when studying ancient texts, when studying concepts from other times that are distant from us, not 50 years, we are not talking about 50 years, we are not talking about 100 years. We are not talking about 500 years, we are talking about over 2,000 years ago. We are talking about that when we are studying ancient texts, so ancient, where concepts persist that, although etymologically related to some of the words we use in our modernity, ontologically, they have a completely different meaning from what we consider democracy, from what we consider a republic, from what we consider freedom. We have to make an effort, and I think all of you agree with me on that. We have to make an effort to understand the organic context of those ancient texts we study, the original organic context, as much as possible, and avoid projecting our modern ideas onto the ancient values they had. Because when we try to understand ancient terms with our modern concepts, with our modern perspectives, we fall into a serious error of interpretation. We reach incorrect conclusions and impose upon the ancients a world they did not know, concept they were not familiar with, ideas that did not occur to them. And in the same way, if we are going to explain a modern idea using the meaning that word had in ancient times, we are completely distorting the current meaning and no one will understand us. Therefore, we must be careful and recognize that language evolves, and with it, the values associated with those words change. And one has to be very careful with that. And that's why I was telling you. Afterwards, you were saying that our concept of democracy, no, it doesn't come from Rome. It doesn't come from Greece. It doesn't come from Mesopotamia. Where does it come from then? Where does it come from? It comes from ethical principles. It comes from the moral principles of our sacred Torah that promotes the sacred idea that all human beings are equal before Joseph, equals before Joseph. How can we assert that the Torah promotes values of equality and human dignity? If the Torah mentions slavery, and in a certain sense as a promised institution, an institution allowed, an institution sanctioned, if it is not, it is a contradiction. Considering that our democracies, our modern democracies, I reject slavery in principle. In principle, and that is exactly what we will answer in today's lesson. Certainly, at first glance, it might seem like a contradiction. However, when we examine the laws of the Torah regarding slavery, and when we examine these concepts of democracy, of republic, of freedom, etc., etc., we specifically examine the laws of the Torah. What does it have to do with slavery? But we have to do it within its organic historical context. We have to do it within the cultural context. And when we do this, then we discover that far from justifying slavery, for example, the Torah introduces principles that have the supreme intention, first of all, to delimit it, limit it, and eventually abolish it, so it is fundamental. Remember that the Torah, our sacred Torah, was revealed in a cultural context where slavery was the accepted norm in all those ancient societies that surrounded the emerging people of Israel. In fact, the Hebrew people come from an experience of slavery for more than 200 years, comes with a slavery mindset, comes with a slave culture. Not at all with the culture of freedom that we have today, not at all with the culture of democracy that we have today, nothing to do with the idea of a republic that we have today. The mindset of the Hebrew people coming out of Egypt is one that comes from a culture that enslaves and is enslaved. So for those ancient times, we are talking about 3,500 years ago, almost 4 millennia ago. For those ancient times, slavery was not only the common practice, it was not only the practice, it was also a common ideology. A common ideology that had a social expression and an economic reality on which those civilizations existed, including the great powers of the time in Mesopotamia and specifically in Africa. The Torah, in the midst of that circumstance, in the midst of that mentality, in the midst of that culture of slavery, instead of immediately eradicating an institution that is deeply rooted in the very essence of people, establishes that what it does sets a framework of laws that first of all limits slavery, second, humanistic slavery, and third, it introduces restrictions and obligations towards slaves that were revolutionary for that time, that were radical for that time, with the migrah. Not to make slavery more bearable with the aim of eventually eradicating slavery, eliminating slavery, but it had to be done. It had to be done in a way socially surgical that would not break the vessel, because it comes from a mindset completely absorbed in slavery. For example, how can we detect that the Torah introduces principles, introduce laws that limit, humanize, and guide those people with a culture of slavery, with a social essence of slavery, with a slave cultural ecosystem? How the Torah introduces concepts that begin to limit, humanize, and eventually eliminate slavery. But when one studies the Torah, you detect that, for example, I'll give you an example. So the year is half the concept of the year, is half the concept of the year, is half impacts. It is introduced into a slaveholding culture to start to limit, humanize, and eventually abolish. One of the key principles in this sense is the sabbatical year, the law of the seventh year, Exodus chapter 21. You can look at it carefully at home, not Exodus chapter 21, where the Torah establishes in a world of slaves, in a slaveholding culture and a slaveholding mentality, the Torah establishes that any Hebrew slave had to be freed after 6 years of service. After 6 years of service, in the seventh, there could be no more slaves. Observe how it is limited. It is limited with the measure of eliminating it, with the measure of eliminating it. If you bought a Hebrew slave, they could only serve you for 6 years. In the seventh year, you had to let him go free without paying you anything, completely free. This concept of halfway introduces a notion of cyclical freedom that did not exist in any other culture of that time. It did not exist in any culture, neither in Mesopotamia nor in Africa, specifically in North Africa. Not in Egypt, the great world power that Egypt was 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. Instead of being slaves for life. For life, the enslaved Hebrews would obtain freedom after a period of 6 years, which is relatively short. And here we are at a principle that limited the scope of slavery. And of course, by doing so, was humanizing to the slave. It was humanizing because if you can only be a slave for 6 years, and in the seventh you have to go free, listen, you have dignity, you have a right to freedom. These are revolutionary concepts for that time. And that's precisely what it's about. That's why it was said, as in the midst of a slave-owning culture, and in the midst of a slave-owning mentality, the Torah introduces concepts that first limit, second humanize, and third finally abrogate slavery. For example, I mentioned the case of Shemitah, right? 6 years, then the seventh year. But there's also the Yobel year, the Jubilee year. It's another revolutionary law. The year of Jubilee. You can read it. You can read the whole chapter 25 of Alekrana from the third book of Monseroveno, the book of Leviticus. And according to this law, every 50 years. Think about that. Every 50 years, a year of freedom was proclaimed throughout the land of Israel. A year of freedom had to be proclaimed throughout the land of Israel. You shall sanctify, says the Torah. The Torah says that is the law that delimits, humanizes, and eventually eliminates. You shall sanctify the 50th year, as says the scripture, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants, because this shall be a year of jubilee for you. And during that year of jubilee, what happened? Not only were all the slaves freed forever, no more, to all the slaves, but also the lands returned to their original owners. It ensured that slavery would not be perpetual, but also guaranteed, so that the economic inequalities would not be perpetuated from one generation to another. In other words, the generational curse was broken. with the middle of the 7th year, and with the year of Jubilee, 7 times 7 years, in the 50th year, families could recover their lands, they could recover their properties, restoring their independence and restoring their dignity. So when we analyze these topics, we find that the Torah contains laws that, although in their historical context, they did not abolish slavery immediately, but they introduced a series of rules, a series of legal principles, where first it was limited, second it was humanized, slavery, and eventually slavery was eliminated in that era. Cesar, when we face the question, well, yes, our concept of democracy, which is what we are discussing in the Shuir, our concept of Western culture today, in the 21st century, we say that it does not come from classical Greece, that it does not come from Rome, that this is a paradigm that we have been made to believe for several centuries, and which is completely false, but its root is in Judaism. Because you cannot say, historically speaking, it is impossible to say that we have received the legacy of democracy from Greece, when in Greece the concept of democracy included slavery. And for us it is totally counterproductive. We cannot inherit democracy from an era and a culture and a society and a country where slavery was the norm for the majority of the people. If in that context we say that the root of our current concept of democracy and Western culture, as we know it, comes from the Torah, but the Torah itself has ideas that support slavery and permit it, how can we say that the root of our democracy comes from the Torah? I am giving you the answer. Yes, as we will find in the Torah. With people who come out of Egypt, who are slaves for 200 years, who have a slave mentality from a world where they know nothing but slavery for most people, where slavery is something of, that's how things have to be. They couldn't conceive of any idea other than being slaves. The Torah introduces principles, norms, and laws into that world that limit, humanize, and eventually abolish slavery. And once in that context, we understand these things, why in the Torah these laws and these norms exist, maintaining that precisely it is Judaism, it is the Torah, the roots. Not Greece, not Rome, it is the Torah, the root of what we now identify as democracy and what we now identify as Western culture. That is the real root. That is the basic principle that we all must keep clear in our minds. Because from this stems an enormous amount of consequences. Enormous consequences. As I mentioned in the last class, if you haven't listened to the last class, I recommend you do. That is, we are talking about how the Torah becomes the most feared book by dictatorships. The Torah is the most revolutionary book you can imagine. It is the book that dictators are terrified of. Why? Because in the Torah is where the root is, where the foundation is, where the ingredient of what we call democracy and Western culture is. To put it in an academic way, it is the Judeo-Christian culture that we have today in the Western world that we love, that we defend, and that in some way we make every effort to nurture and support, to consider that it is the best we can obtain in this present moment that humanity is experiencing. We will explore this in classes. Next, but it is important that you have these ideas clear. It is important that these ideas are well thought over in your mind and heart so that no one can deceive you. With all these philosophies, with all these paradigms, even social dogmas that for so many centuries have been dragging modern society up to today, making us believe things that are not at all as they are being said.